Good afternoon and welcome to day two of Defending the Early Years 2021 Summer Virtual Institute. My name is Denisha Jones and I have the pleasure of being the co-director of Defending the Early Years. If you missed day one, we invite you to check out the Facebook Live recording on our Facebook page. We will send video links to everyone who registered. It takes a couple days after the Institute to get those together. But in the meantime, everything's been live streamed. We started day one thinking about leveraging learning, building upon all the amazing things we saw our children and our families and our teachers do during a global pandemic. We heard from Kathy about learning and about thinking about play and free play and guided play. And then we had an amazing panel with parents and early childhood teachers and advocates really thinking about how do we make our children in school better than it was before. Today, we're going to focus more on play because that is a big part of our advocacy at Defending the Early Years. And we're also going to talk about advocacy as well, too. So first up, we have a discussion with Pasi Sahlberg and William Doyle, who recently, last year, I believe, published the book, Let the Children Play, How More Play Will Save Our Schools and Help Children Thrive. And so we had a conversation, me and Nancy Carlson-Page, our wonderful co-founder and executive president. And so we're going to have a conversation with Bill and Pasi about play and about what we can do to ensure that children have access to play. And then we're going to come back and have our advocacy chat. First with Cassie Creswell and the Illinois Families for Public Education and their recent victory of legislating a right to play in Illinois. And then we have a recently announced guest, Congressman Jamal Bowman, will be on hand to talk with us about how we can continue our advocacy efforts. So we are in for a treat for day two. So welcome and thank you for joining us. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited for you to join us for today's conversation of day two of the Defending the Early Years Virtual Institute. I'm so excited to be in conversation today with two of our guests, Pasi Sahlberg and William Doyle, and Nancy Carlson-Page, our fearless leader. So we're going to get started right away. Pasi Sahlberg is a Finnish educator and the author of over 100 articles and books on education. He's advised schools and education leaders in countries around the world. His most recent book, Let the Children Play, How More Play Will Save Our Schools and Help Children Thrive, is co-authored with William Doyle, who is here with us today. Welcome, Pasi.
Thank you.
William Doyle is an author and TV producer, a Fulbright scholar, and an advisor to the Ministry of Education and Culture of Finland. Along with Pasi, Bill is a dedicated advocate for children's needs and right to play. Welcome, Bill.
Hi, it's great to be with you.
Thanks. Nancy Carlson-Page is an educator, author, professor emerita at Lesley University, where she taught teachers for more than 30 years and co-founder of Defending the Early Years. Like Pasi and Bill, Nancy's an outspoken advocate for children's play and well-being.
Good morning, everybody. I'm thrilled to have this discussion and so grateful that you two were able to be with us. You have contributed so much to the field of education and our understanding of children's play and how they thrive through play and the things that interfere with that. So I'm very excited about having this discussion and glad that our DEY community that's very widespread and strong gets to hear from you.
Great. So let's kick off our discussion with you, Pasi. Can you talk to us about how children's play has been disappearing in many countries and why you think that is?
Yes, again, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be in this particular group and talk about this very, very important issue. Well, first of all, we know quite a bit about the how children play today, particularly compared to how they played, how children played like 20, 30 years ago. We have done some research. I'm talking to you from Sydney, Australia, so we have done some research here. A similar research have been done in the United States and across the European Union about this issue. And the interesting way to ask this question is that when we ask parents here that how much their children play compared to what they themselves played when they were at the age of their own kids, about 90% of parents say that they play often significantly less, their own children, compared to what they did. Of course, this is based on their own memories, but I think it's very telling that practically all the parents say that the how the kids play today is not what it used to be. And of course, this raises questions like, why this is happening. One reason is definitely that the children in general are just spending their free time when they're not in school in a very different ways than they did 10, 20 years ago. I mean, we had TV and media and other things around, but nothing like we have now. Again, our research here shows that the children are as young as 4 years old when they get their own digital gadget, the portable device that's often iPad or similar. And, a lot of time goes to, playing games and searching stuff and watching YouTube videos and many other things. In other words, that the kids today are spending much more time with the digital media and with the technologies. They stay indoors much more than they used to. So this is one reason that the kids are simply spending their free time in a very different ways often than they used to 20 years ago. The other thing is that we are seeing our education systems also changing much more towards starting the formal learning much younger than what it used to be. We often say that the kindergartens, speaking about the United States, has become the first, the new first grade, and it's the same issue here. That it's not rare to see 4-year-olds in the early childhood centers that are often actually called learning centers or even academies, practicing stuff so that they can be successful kindergarten and primary school kids, which is of course, taking a time away from them to play and, do what the kids are supposed to do. So the education systems in many ways, and not just the early childhood education, but education in general, has become much more serious thing. And there's much more testing going on. There are much more higher expectations for kids' performance. And this is often, when you look at the schools, you can see this in the ways that, the schools are stealing the time away from play and free time and recess, and using that time to prepare kids for the tests. And this is really happening across the board, not just here in Australia, United States. This is a very common thing in many countries. So we have really seen a kind of a decline of children's opportunities to play in many ways. Partly this is an issue that parents need to address when they are with their children at home, but it's a big thing in our education policies and education systems and reforms around the world. So I think finally, there's no question about it that in most countries around the world, we have seen this decline of playtime in and out of school. And that's why these conversations what we are having here are so critically important.
Yes, I think we've all seen that as well too. It is very important. Thank you.
Hazi, just one follow-up question. Here in the United States, I'm more familiar with how all of this education reform came about. And a lot of it was really propelled by a few people with a lot of money. And that pumped into the education system rapidly and started to really reshape policy very quickly. But the fact that it's happening around the world is, I'm just wondering, what are the factors making this happen in many other countries? Is that too broad a question?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And, we, in our book, Let the Children Play, and in my earlier writings, I've been using the term global education reform movement. That is a kind of it's a kind of an educational pandemic in a sense that it's affecting different countries and different parts of the world in similar ways. The interesting thing in education is that the governments and politicians and also those people who have funds to put in education, that they seem to be following one another, and often, unfortunately, they are following a kind of a more likely the bad ideas. Yeah. That are, some of them ideas I mentioned earlier. So I think it's not. global education is not operating in a way that you would see a lot of creative systems, working their own ways and trying different new things and doing things in different ways. Many education systems, they are kind of imitating to one another. And I must say that the United States, with the good things in education there, and also the problematic or bad things, still is a very significant role model for many education systems. And that's why, what happens in the United States, again, in a positive and negative sense in education, is a very significant thing globally, explaining what is happening in a global education thing. So that's why it's a little bit like this current global health pandemic. We have had this in education for the last 20 years, that the similar things have been adopted in national education policies around the world, in not all the countries, but most of the countries. And some of them have been really harmful for young children and their freedom to play and freedom to learn in early years.
Oh, that's helpful. Thanks. So William, hi there. So one of the things I've wanted to know more about is what did you observe about play and changes in play in school or out of school that led to you and Pazzi writing the book, Let the Children Play, which we highly recommend. That book is fantastic. I hope everybody will get it and read it. My education book group read it and we discussed it, and I can affirm everyone thinks it's a terrific book.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. My parents co-founded the first Montessori school in New York City back in the 60s. And I was one of the first test subjects. And that, of course, is a very programmed, play-based early education model. I remember it being completely joyful and a fantastic experience. Now, I forgot all about childhood education for the next so many years. And then I had a child of my own who is now 13, living with me here in Helsinki. And the changes that we noticed, well, I came to this as a New York parent. Like so many parents, I want what's best for my child. I want my child to succeed in life. And it turns out that, when you cut through all the research and you cut through all the non-educators who are interfering with national education systems, you wind up with a beautiful quote from the American Academy of Pediatrics, which has sort of become I should put this on my business card. I discovered this and it really kind of changed the way I think of things. According to the Doctors of America, pediatricians who synthesized all the research, and there is great research on play in childhood education, they came to the conclusion that, quote, the lifelong success of children is based on their ability to be creative and to apply the lessons learned from playing, unquote. Now, if that's true, that should be the lodestar. That play should be the thing that we're all, as parents, as citizens, as professors, should be moving toward, stampeding toward, and trying to understand more about. Now, I came to this through my interest in school integration and desegregation. I hail from New York City, which is shamefully and chronically the most segregated school system in the United States of America. It hasn't changed since I was a child. And I was, in the course of working on 2 books about higher education, integration and desegregation historically, with the great civil rights hero, James Meredith, who just celebrated his 88th birthday. For those who don't know, he was Martin Luther King's #1 personal hero of his life, so in Letter from a Birmingham Jail. In the course of working out 2 books with him, I came across, I spoke with Howard Gardner, the great educator at Harvard, who told me, quote, if you want to improve America's schools, learn from Finland, which does much the opposite of everything we're doing in the United States and has the most effective schools. That led me to Pasi Sahlberg, and I asked him, why are Finland schools so effective? And he said, we're not really sure. We have some good ideas. One of the big ideas might be play. Constant periods of intellectual physical freedom and discovery and experimentation and no fear of failure for children. That's just a constant pattern through childhood and in school here in education. That fascinated me, and that led me to want to raise my child, at least part of the time, in Finland. In fact, my son right now is literally in the woods playing with a buddy of his, a 12-year-old girl. He's 13, a 12-year-old girl who last week told me my second favorite quote of this subject, and on this subject. And that was, I was asking her, at what age do you think you'll get out of the playground? Like you just shift into other kinds of play. And she fixed me with a firm stare and said, I will always be a child. I will never stop playing, and I will never leave the playground. I thought, okay, got it. And I thought that that was a beautiful way. So in other words, the thing that children seem to want the most, yearn for, in school and out of school, these periods of freedom and fun and joy that we should be delivering to them in school, the thing that they want the most seems to be what helps them the most in school, to focus, to be happy, to want to go to school, and this applies to 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, I would argue, Pasti and I would argue, all the way through higher education, which should be delivered in a playful, wonderful way, with some adjustments, of course, for age, and that's what children need the most, and it's what we're taking away from them the most in the last 40 years. So that's the big change that I've seen. Play has been demolished in much of American education, and that's a tragedy, and we've got to fight back, and there are some wonderful parents out there who are doing just that. And you're about to talk to one of them.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I agree. This erosion of play is very worrisome for lots of families and lots of people. But I also think there's this devaluing of play, right? And yeah, yes, we know what the American pediatrics have said and other people, but we still have a lot of people. I've met early childhood teachers, I've met parents who just don't see the value in play. So can we talk about this a little bit? Your book details the research on the value and importance of play. So can you both comment on this? Maybe you start first, Pasi, but what would you say is one of the values of play and why we should be concerned about this erosion of play?
Yeah, I would actually change the question a little bit. We should not always ask the value, or how much something would add to particularly children. I think when it comes to play, I think the most important thing, and this is particularly a fundamental principle in Finland, is that play is a basic human right of every child. It's not about value. It's about it's a human right issue, and this is something that we all have signed ourselves into. That we recognize the Declaration of the Right of the Child, which basically says the same thing, and I think. I understand your question about the value, but I would kind of argue that we should ask less about the value of something and more about, why is it important thing? And it is important because it's every child has a right to play. And of course, only after that comes this question of how does it benefit the children? Why is it good for kids to play? If I can go a little bit back to what William was talking about, our first conversations about Finland's education, and this question that why is it so effective? It took me a while to really understand this myself, and I spent most of my life in Finland as a teacher and educator and teacher educator, and then spent a number of years in the United States. But I still didn't kind of ask myself ever this question of what makes the Finnish education system more effective or different. And during these conversations and discussions with William, I realized that actually. The power of the Finnish education system when it comes to early childhood education is that we don't do much with kids. We just let them play. We just let them grow as they are. And Finland has been very systematic and strong in respecting this human rights aspect of early childhood, that the children have a right to be children as long as possible. This is what most of the Finnish parents want, that they expect that their children should be children as long as they can. William was speaking about this 12-year-old girl who thought like, you know, that she will never leave the playground. And there, I think we need to think. We need to think differently about this early childhood part, and particularly play. And my way of thinking about that is the kind of a fundamental right of the child, without any kind of a expectation of it giving a value. It's just is something that we should allow all the children to do. But William, probably you may have another perspective on this thing.
Well, absolutely. If I can add something, and that is that I think we've lost our minds. We have lost our minds in the United States when it comes to childhood education. And I don't mean clinical insanity necessarily. I mean that we have forgotten how to be mindful. And one aspect of being mindful in this arena, I would say, is to listen to children, to pay close attention to what they are biologically programmed to do, what they enjoy doing the most, and to examine the evidence. And all of that will lead you to the opposite path than we're now doing, of crushing them with academics much too early, of removing play from every classroom in the public school system. So, and a really dangerous aspect of this is that the children who suffer the most from play removal, play deprivation in early years are children from challenging circumstances, poverty, and so forth. Now, that's a theory. I don't know where it came from, but it might be driven by politicians who look at data and think, well, the data's bad in the inner city schools. Therefore, let's pump more content, more time, more pressure, more penalties into the 4, 5, and 6-year-olds so they can get ready for kindergarten and they can survive. They can have a thriving life, and that hasn't worked. For 20 years, we've tried that. Hasn't worked at all. The evidence is in, the numbers are in, doesn't move the needle. So it's time to think of something new. And Pasti and I got into debate with a so-called education reformer who said this was a dangerous book. Let the Children Play was a dangerous book. Because if we did what the authors are saying, it's fine for middle-class children. Oh, they'll do great with play. But if you do it to disadvantaged children, social chaos, complete breakdown of society. This is literally what he said. So we said, well, the American Academy of Pediatrics says that these are the children that need play the most and who suffer the most from not having play every day in school and in life. So that's the worst part of this discussion, is that these children are suffering the most, and we've got to give them what the doctors say they need and what I think the children themselves would say they need and yearn for.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we've heard that a few times. I think, Nancy, remember with the Brookline teachers in Massachusetts who were advocating for more play. And, you know, of course, we reached out to them to see how we could support. And she said, how do I tell the superintendent who tells me poor Black and Latino children don't need play, they need academics? And that's the mantra, right? And I'm like, first of all, you tell him that's a very racist idea, right? To deny these kids access to play because of their race, because of their circumstances, that they need less play than other kids who get it, right? Like, but that's the mindset of these people who think they're doing reform, right? They think they're clothing these manufactured achievement gaps when they're making them worse, right? They're making them widen. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate the idea that it's not so much a value, it is a right, but we have that issue in the United States where we haven't signed on, right, to that concept of rights of children. We don't really fully believe. So I think that's another area we have to work in. But thank you both for those comments.
You know, that your comments, both of you, they really give me pause. I realize that when I speak and just all the traveling around I do, talking to people, I use that phrase, the value of play, all the time. And this is the first time, Paz, you'd made me realize, why do I do that? I do it because I'm defensive about it, because out of the gate, nobody believes play is worth anything. And they think it's a dichotomous from learning. And if kids are playing, they're not doing anything. They're just wasting time. So I'm feeling always like I've got to come up from the rear with an explanation of why they should even listen to me. And it's a big leap and an important one to honor the fact that it's a right of childhood. And like Denise says, it's hard for people in the US to get that when we didn't even sign on you know, one of two countries in the world, I think, to the rights of the UN rights of the child.
Yeah, Nancy, and I think it's quite okay, and actually it's important to ask about the value of play and, you know, many other things, but it should not be the first question. I think we need to really help people to see this human right thing. But, you know, then the other thing is that I'm saying this as somebody who spent a number of years in living with my family in the United States, that you know, the American culture in general, and certainly the education is much more, you know, based on this idea that everything has to be measured and everything must have a value, and we need to be able to turn this value into a number and then compare it to, you know, how this same thing plays out in different contexts, and then see, you know, who is better than the other one. And, you know, somebody told me, I remember my first time in the United States, somebody said that when I was kind of asking that, why do you have so kind of a deep interest in measuring everything in education? Somebody said to me that in the United States, you know, if something moves, it must be measured. They are so deep in this culture of this kind of a passion to measure and evaluate everything. I came from, and I still come from, the Nordic country and Nordic culture that is very different. That there we can kind of celebrate some of these natural things, like, you know, play is some of them. It's not just Finland, it's the same. You know, Denmark is a huge play nation. It's a home of Lego and Anderson and many other things. Sweden and Norway, Iceland are the same thing. And there we don't ask these questions there about, you know, measuring something or valuing something. It's just that we celebrate the fact that, you know, children are children, and they should have this right to remain children as long as they want to. You know, that's why the Nordic countries like Finland and some others, that we start formal education often much later than older age than the others. In Finland, kids are normally 7 years before they ever experience a kind of a formal schooling. And it's quite all right to go to school without, you know, being able to read or write or these things. In Finland, we say that the school readiness means that the school has to be ready for different types of children, whereas there in the United States, it's much more, school readiness is the idea that the child has to be ready to start the school at the kind of a certain level of standard. And it's, again, I think it's beautifully illustrates this very different way of, you know, looking at children, that they grow in a different ways and they're very different. And we should not insist that the children have to change, that we have to get them to the certain point or level before they are able to start the school. I think, you know, all the kids should be welcome to every single school as they are. And then it's the responsibility of the school is to make sure that every child feels welcome and safe and comfortable in the school, and the teachers and teaching and curriculum, you know, all those things are adapted to each and every child. You know, that's what makes primary education so complicated and difficult. If you adapt this concept of school readiness, if you follow the earlier one, that the schools are kind of tuned into serve a similar type of kids. It's an easy place. It's like factory, and that's why we need teachers and educators that are much highly and well prepared than they are in the early years, in early childhood education and primary school.
Well, there's also wonderful news here, because you know, you can't flip a switch and get America to think Nordically when it comes to children. I wish we could, but the great news is that you can make an empirical, measurable, results-based argument for play if you want to. And I think the answer, Nancy, to what you're saying about being defensive rather than offensive is totally true. If we present the research and the science and the case studies in a clear, compelling, inspiring way, great things will happen. Illinois just passed the recess law.
You froze.
Relatively a great before the pandemic, yeah. And that was spearheaded by one of the most conservative mom legislators in Arkansas. And the same thing happened in North Carolina, and the same thing is happening in progressive, so-called progressive school districts. So parents and educators can change this. And the reason is that the other side has no empirical evidence to support their argument.
One of the things I loved about your book, I think it's one chapter primarily summarized research. And I remember thinking when I was reading it, this is a great, tome. This is one place people can go where there's a summary of a lot of this positive research. I haven't seen it summarized that comprehensively someplace else. So it's a real value. I appreciated also you mentioning the issue of children from underserved communities and people's perceptions of play. That's something we've struggled with, and Denise and I have discussed many times, and we're worried about now. Even if you look at what's happened with play in the US, the kindergarten classrooms that have become devoid of child choice, play, the arts, activity centers, and replaced with worksheets. The most extreme examples of those are in low-income communities of children of color. And so we're worried now, even as the Biden administration begins to put more money into early childhood, that it's going to go in that kind of apartheid direction where, the more advantaged kids, as Pozi's saying, they get to play. And then the kids who get identified as having deficits because of the way they're looked at in the first place get an inferior form of teacher-driven instruction.
Well, think about that, Nancy. That in a literal sense is a violation of pediatric medical guidelines, as offensive and dangerous as would be if we told poor families, don't put your children in car seats, don't immunize your children, don't corporal punishment them as much as you want. That is irresponsible. And I don't think that politicians or many parents or many educators yet understand that. Maybe it's our job as play advocates to do that. I sent my son to a high poverty inner city New York City school that was very progressive, self-described progressive. And I found out that young boys, often boys of color, were being punished by the administration for wiggling and running down the steps and goofing off on the lunch line by having their recess routinely taken away. And it happened to my son once or twice, and actually I got angry, and I wound up leading a effort to have our school district pass a resolution in favor of recess and asking the school and New York City school system to honor its own policy, which forbids that. So that resolution was passed in District 1, what was in our district, District 2, the most white and affluent district, and District 3, which includes large sections of Harlem. And that happened just because, one dad showed up at school board meetings, and the school board, all parents said, that's crazy. You can't take recess away from children. And this happens all the time in New York City and around the country. So again, evidence put forward by parents and teachers, I think, can really change things.
Oh, thanks. That's inspiring. That makes us think, well, we have a lot to talk about after this, just ways to do our advocacy, maybe in a bit of a different way. It's good. It's interesting that statement from the American Academy of Pediatrics is so profound, so wonderful. And it really hasn't been cited or mentioned much in this country. It's unbelievable because it's powerful.
Yeah.
And we haven't, and so maybe there's opportunities there to do that, but they put it out, but we all grabbed onto it, but I never saw it, get any traction in major media, for example.
Well, Nancy, they're masterpiece reports because they synthesize all the science, and nobody else has done that. And there are, I think, about 3 of them. One focusing on disadvantaged children in recess, one focusing on play in general for younger kids, and another one children, and another one play in general. So those 3 reports, I think, should be on the desk of every administrator and politician and policymaker in the United States of America. How much does it cost? There are links we can send around. And when we show up at meetings, we should say, don't your children deserve this? Don't my children, all children deserve this? And what's your evidence in opposition for this. And they really, you know, they have none. I think we need to speak up more, as parents just did in Illinois, and parents are starting to, you know, in Arizona, a mother was walking by a recess yard and she saw little children, these are third, fourth graders, I think, with their noses against concrete pillars in a line. Now, this is a real scene in the United States of America, and they were being forced to not join in recess because they were late on their homework. Other children were being forced to sit in the recess yard with their heads down, finishing their homework as children played in front of them. So they would see what they were missing, which, you know, I hate to use the word, but that's kind of sadistic. And this is a kind of a dysfunction we have that we really have to educate each other about, educate other parents about. Because I know many parents think, you know, the more we crush our children with academics the earlier, then my child will then get into Harvard or Yale or Princeton. And again, I don't think the evidence base is very good for that. And the beautiful thing is that when we do what you and Denisha have been crusading for, beautiful things happen. Even if you want to measure it, great things happen. Although I don't think that's, as Pasi was saying, I don't think that's the point of all this. The point is to celebrate childhood and to welcome children into the world with love and patience and the freedom to fail. The freedom to fail is just as important as the right to fail is just as important as the right to succeed, as James Meredith has often told me.
Well, I think you're both also implying there's not an understanding of the significance of failure here in our country because of the kind of expectations we impose on ourselves and our children, as Pasi was mentioning. But as we all know, it's critical actually to not fail is to not learn, because there's as much value in not getting the right answer or falling down or making some misstep. The learning is just as valuable as if you succeeded, and sometimes more valuable, obviously. That's a horrifying story, the one you're describing about the playground. And I'm sorry to say it's probably not that unique. And it leads me to explore a little more with you, Pasi. What is it about the Finnish education system? Because there's something about the quality of the human beings who are working with children. That's a stark contrast. You wouldn't see that in Finland. And what are some of the reasons why that your school system is so successful?
Yeah, I think it's the, you know, there are many ways to answer that question. There are many stories there, but I think that they fundamentally what the Finns have been able to do, and I must admit that I want to give a lot of credits, probably the equal credit, to all the other Nordic countries, because we are very similar in the sense of, you know, how do we view education, you know, what are the basic values there, that we, you know, we try to keep things simple, and we try to, whenever the Nordics are designing something, whether they are buildings, the architecture, or clothes, or cinema, or TV dramas, you know, there's one thing in common, and it's that there's this basic idea is always visible there. It's not hidden under the, you know, all kinds of decorations and other things. And it's the same thing with Finnish education. It's a very, very lean and plain and clean and simple structure that starts with this question that, you know, what is learning and what is the child? And we spoke about the children's rights earlier. And then we have been building this whole education system around that. And it's a very different, it looks very differently in Finland and Nordic countries compared to, you know, if you go to England, for example, or most other countries, United States or here in Australia, where there's so many things, you know, put around there that, you know, you don't really see this idea of education anymore. So I think that we have really, you know, valued the importance of understanding child and childhood. I think we have really clarified the process and the purpose of learning in general. I think the Finnish system is particularly successful because we have adopted early on this idea that the main function of the education is to educate people to be different. And that, that's why we don't employ standardized assessments or national standards that would assume that every child has to be able to meet the same and similar standards before they graduate. That the Finnish system is very tolerant in these differences, and seeing children and people as kind of a more holistic way, that you can be talented and intelligent in many different ways, not just in literacy and numeracy, as it is here, for example, or many other places. And, if you have a system where you allow people to grow just like plants in a garden, that you're going to see much more kind of a richer and beautiful range of people coming out of this system than if you try to standardize and force people into the same kind of a similar model. And then finally, I think what Finland has understood probably earlier and more clearly than anybody else is that you really need to have high professionals, working in the schools and early childhood centers to be able to understand this complexity, kind of an organic nature of education. Wherever education is seen as a technical or mechanical craft, as it is in many places now, anybody can teach. You can have people taking a few weeks training online course, and then you can assume that these people are ready to go to school and just follow the script and make sure that everything is done on time. But the Finnish system doesn't work like this, or the Nordic systems don't work like this, because there we see understand education much more kind of a organic thing. So there's no one kind of a simple basic answer to this question that what makes Finnish system perform better. I'm now insisting people to ask question, not to ask question that what makes Finland better than any all the other education systems. I'm trying to help people to ask questions that what makes Finnish system or Nordic systems different, and why these education systems are so different in many ways. And sometimes we are able to produce better results in some areas than the others. But I think the key point is that why do we have different education systems, and why Finns, for example, why we never wanted to adapt the American model or the British model or some other model. So we wanted to have a kind of a Nordic idea of how to educate and respect human beings and children particularly.
I would add that Finland is the one nation on earth that honors the United States Supreme Court ruling of 1954 the most, and people sometimes forget that it was not just about school desegregation, it was about resources and the treatment of children. And the Supreme Court in the Brown decision in 1954 stated that public education is, quote, a right which must be made available to all on equal terms, unquote. That means you really have to work at that. Now, that's delivered here. I've been a public school parent in New York City, in Tokyo, and in Finland at a teacher training school, a neighborhood school, and now at a large municipal school here. And that is the mantra. Not only that children should be children, that they should play, but they should be treated as individuals, respected as individuals, and given equal treatment on a national scale. Now people say, well, it's Finland, it's homogenous, it's a small country. And well, guess what? It's like 3/4 of American states are 5 to 10 million people, 90% so-called white, 5 to 12% childhood poverty. It's not that different from much of America. And people say, well, you can't change American culture. And I say that's nonsense. In less than one generation, we've gone to where we are now, from a culture that respected teachers and did not live and die by the sword of standardized testing, to where we are now, which hasn't worked at all. That is the beast that's in this discussion right now, lurking, and that's the beast of standardized testing. And that's not a factor here. I don't think it ever will be. Children are assessed every day instead by professional educators. That's the difference. I told a Finnish teacher once about these annual standardized tests that kind of have overwhelmed the American system. And he said, what? Why would you do that? I assess my children every day, and that's what teachers are supposed to do. So again, I think we need to sort of wake up and help our fellow citizens wake up, but that there is a better way, and we can try to do much better. And Finland has a lot to learn from the United States. I've seen teachers in inner city New York City schools who are just as inspiring and just as wonderful as any teacher I've met here in Finland, and just as qualified.
That's right.
With master's degrees. The gap is the belief that there's a Finnish way of doing things. I heard that said to me once in Finland, where, well, we can't do that because that's the way we do things in Finland. And I thought, that's not a good reason. So let's all learn from each other. We'll make it a much better world when it comes to childhood education.
I think one of the things you guys are getting at is our lack of a philosophy, value, belief about young children, right? So when I wrote a chapter about play being the antidote to germ, I quoted Judith Wagner, who we presented together about Nordic education and American education, and this idea, this thing of the good child, right? This ideal that permeates Nordic countries, right? The good childhood is something to ascribe to, right? And what does that mean, right? And we don't have a philosophy like that. I think in America, it's kind of like children are to be seen, not heard, right? We don't really have this philosophy that shows our value and belief and support of children, where other countries do. Even Australia, they had they studied child well-being, and they had factors that looked at what contributed to child well-being. And in America, all we had was the Children's Defense Fund that looked at how horrible America was to children when you just look at the outcomes, right? So we're looking at outcomes and saying, okay, America's not treating children well, but we don't have a national kind of philosophy about, well, how do we treat children well? All children, not just some children, right, who are entitled to it. And because of that idea that some children are deserving and some children are not, it's one of the reasons why we don't really have a lot of nice things in this country, because those people are afraid of that those undeserving people are going to get some of it. So they'd rather nobody get it, right? So it's kind of like fills this prophecy where you deny everybody all the good stuff because you're so worried about that. And so in the standardized testing, as you mentioned, right? And so we believe in measuring everything, and that really undermines our ability to believe in play. I think when people say this is dangerous, it's because it's low cost, right? Everyone wants to pump all this money into curriculum and all this. And I'm like, you can cancel all of that and just let the children play with materials that aren't toys, that aren't created by big corporations, that are just, boxes and recyclable materials, and you can see a lot of this creativity. So it really threatens, right, the American way. And I think ideally for me, what I'm saying, it shifts the role of the educator. Bill and I were in Aji, China at the conference, right? The True Play conference. And you really see the role of teachers differently when play is the leading way that you engage with children. You have to observe, you have to reflect, right? You're not really there trying to guide and get in the way and tell children what to think. And so that's also a shift. And it makes standardized assessments obsolete. You don't need to assess children that way when you can just observe them play and kind of document what they're doing. And so I think it's scary for a lot of people. And how do we kind of get people to that shift where do we need, I don't know if some people have an idea, but maybe we need this national philosophy or belief about what children are entitled to really then guide us moving forward in this work.
But I think this is wonderful. But I think, the intriguing question here now is that why we are so different. I'm talking about the United States and the Nordic countries. And, people often ask me the same question, that how can it be that in a place like Finland, or it can be any other Nordic country, that we have been able to come to the point where the childhood means so much more and different things than in the United States or much of the rest of the world. And why we have been able to, resist these crazy ideas of toxic standardized testing and accountability things in our cultures. And I'm going to offer you one thing that can be probably the best way to explain this difference and answer this question than anything else. And it is that we have, in all of our societies, including Finland, that we have practically equal power politically and even economically between women and men. So we have, in all the Nordic countries, have about almost half of the political power is at the hands of the women. In our parliament, we have 45, 47% female. The government ministers, departments, like your secretaries, half of them, actually this government had more women in power than men. And this is not just something that has happened now. This has been the thing for the last 30 years. It's the same in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland. And one example, I think we explain this, give this example in this book, is that I was hosting an American delegation, very high-level delegation a few years ago in Finland, and they came to see this miracle of Finnish education. And I took them to our parliament, and they met the parliament's education committee. That is like a highest political education task force within our parliament. And one of the questions there was by these American delegates was that, after hearing all these wonderful things about early childhood education, and every child in Finland has a right to high quality and safe early childhood education for free, and all these beautiful things there. How did you ever come into a kind of a political consensus and understanding of these things? And the answer was that this was done by women 30 years ago. And just look at your political systems there in Washington, D.C. or the States. You have barely 20% voice in the hands of the women. And, it's a kind of if you really go to the roots of this thing, it's easy to understand, the state of things in education, and, why some certain things are so much more important in the United States than here. This thing in Finland has been built primarily through the initiatives of strong visionary women in our politics, and it's the same in all the Nordic countries. So in one way, this is a very pessimistic view, because changing this political balance, gender balance in the United States can take some time. But I think that people also need to understand that if we want to have a different societies for ourselves, if we want to have a safer world for our children, if we want to be, have our mothers valued more than they are now in the United States, we have to start to talk more seriously about the gender equality. And that is, for me, if I look at the United States now as a Nordic citizen, for me, this is one of the biggest issues there. And the things are not likely to change very quickly in the United States or here in Australia is in the same way, before we give equal power to women to say what is important and how we should educate the children, support families, and many other things. So give power to women will make a huge difference, and sustainably, change things.
If I could just add something. What Pasi just said is so important that it inspired my next book, which I co-authored with my wife, Naomi Moriyama. The subject is gender progress here in Finland, which I would argue is the best in the world, with maybe Iceland and Norway a close second. And that propels much of the society's progress. This is not a perfect society by any means. Finnish people will be the first to tell you that. But what Pasi said is absolutely striking. I talked to the president of Finland for 12 years, a woman named Tarja Halonen, not long ago. And she said, I am so proud that I can live in a country where children are allowed to be children and they're allowed to play, period. And I thought that, you're right, Denisha, that's something somehow, I think it's in the back of our minds as moms and dads and citizens and aunts and uncles, but it hasn't been pulled out and celebrated. And once it is, I think it could catch on. And I think we should spread that throughout the culture, especially now that in America, in the post-COVID environment where everything has to be rethought in education. As Plato said, everything should be reimagined, everything should be questioned. And now that the standardized tests are scrambled, the data is totally scrambled. It meant nothing, it meant little to begin with. Now it means even less because you have 2 years of totally imperfect data. By the way, what did 20 years of standardized testing, which was the brainchild of Teddy Kennedy and George Bush, what did it give us? Did the test scores go up? With all this spending on the testing and all this pressure on the kids and all this focus on the data didn't budge. It budged a little for 4th grade math, and then it washed out in high school. So, you know, it was a boondoggle. It's over. We'd have no reason to continue it. What do we do instead of that? And I think that the thinking of play and celebration of childhood is a big clue to the direction that we should go in going forward.
I'm just reflecting on these profound things you're saying. And, you know, one of the big elements that fueled ed reform in the US was the Common Core State Standards that was literally almost overnight imposed on our education system. And these were standards that were written, I think, primarily by men. I read all the bios of all the people who wrote them, but there were a lot of them imposed on kindergarten, and there wasn't a single early childhood educator or education professional included in writing them. So some of what we see, like I'm reflecting back on the horrible playground situation, is anger in teachers, because there's oppression of teachers' views. And one of the things about Finland that came through really strong in Pasi's book, Finished Lessons, that I love that book, is how much teachers have power and they collaborate. They work together. They're not alone. They're not fearful. They're empowered and they're working together, and they have a lot. They're really basically in charge of how the curriculum is developed in their schools and a lot of other things about their schools and how they're connected to community. And that we've lost that so much here in the United States. It's all top down, policy driven, and by people who aren't educators and who are mostly men. So it's a tough road to hoe.
Yeah, but you know, Nancy, the irony of this thing, I think you're absolutely right. When it comes to Finland, is that in Finland we are just basically putting in practice the good theories and research and evidence from the United States. So, you know, many of these things that you mentioned about the teachers' work and the professionalism and collaboration and those things have been heavily inspired by your American colleagues in different parts of your beautiful country. And that's again, an intriguing question for me, that, you know, how can it be that that over there in the United States, the states or the federal policies and reforms so systematically ignore and undermine the work and research and evidence that has been conducted and done there, that has been so influential. You don't need to go further than Canada to see how influential the American models and ideas and innovation in education have been, but not in the US. And that's, again, you know, it may sound like a bad news, but the good news is that, you know, these people are there. There's a lot of, America is the powerhouse of education, innovation and research and evidence and new ideas. So everything is there. So it's not just think about Finland, because we had, like, during the last 30 years, we have had very kind of a limited amount of national resources when it comes to education, research, and innovation. You know, most of these things have been imported from often from the United States, but you don't need to do that. Everything is there. You just need to turn back to the you know, the best evidence and the leading thought leaders and practitioners in the United States, and everything is there.
Absolutely. Pasi, can I say something? As a red-blooded American man, I want to tell you that I think the United States can lead the world in childhood well-being, in childhood play, in reintroducing physical activity to the daily life of all our school children, fun, inclusive physical education and recess, and periods of intellectual and physical freedom and joy, and all these wonderful things that Denisha and Nancy Carlson-Page have been fighting for years as the world leaders in the subject. We can lead the world. Let's have a 5-year plan. We will beat Finland. We will beat anybody in a good way. We will work together with the world to truly lead the world in childhood education and making it something beautiful and effective from now on. We can do it. And this is the engine, I think, this way of thinking.
Oh, I would love that. What an inspiration. What do you think, Denisha?
I am all in. I love everything. I just, you know, hearing Pasi talk about women, you know, William, it made me think of Miss Chung and Angie, and how one woman for 18 years, 16, 18 years, has just said, let me try and make things better for these children that I've been given, entrusted with their care. And she's revolutionizing, right? And yeah, it is the women who, when we give them the space, right? Those women, the people you're talking about that have got all these great American ideas that every other country is taking but us, probably are women, right? A lot of women who are doing the work. And so we can do it. And I think we need to push everyone to do it. And I'm energized. This has been an amazing conversation. Just want to thank you all so much for talking with us and helping us. I think Nancy, we see Defending the Early Years is leading the way. We're going to keep pushing on this because it's super important. And you mentioned Illinois. We are talking to Kathy Creswell next about that work in Illinois and the right to play bill. I mean, that legislation, just watching that unfold was just really exciting. I didn't have to testify, but I was on standby to testify numerous times waiting for the call in, and they got it passed. And so we're going to have a great conversation with her about that too. But I just want to thank you, Poppy, and thank you, William, and Nancy too, for joining us today and having this great conversation that I think will continue to push others to this world where play is the right of all children, and we want to make that a reality here in the United States and everywhere else. Thank you all so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for your leadership. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as Nancy and I did this morning, having it with William and with Pavi, and just, talking about play and how important that is. And so now, we're really excited to bring in Kathy Creswell for part of our next conversation. So let's see. Kathy is co-founder and director of the Illinois Families for Public Schools. Kathy has been advocating on public education issues in Chicago since 2010. Through the Illinois Families for Public Schools, a grassroots advocacy group, Kathy worked to pass the right to play in the Illinois state legislature, and she has worked to pass legislation on testing, class size, and a landmark student privacy bill in 2019. She is currently an interim co-chair of the National Parent Coalition of Student Privacy, and also serves as a parent representative and chair of the local school council at her daughter's high school. Kathy has a PhD in computational linguistics, and she is going to join us today with a conversation with Nancy about this amazing work that you did. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, Cassie. It's really nice to meet you, and it's so exciting to see what's happened in Illinois, and many people are going to want to hear about this because hopefully legislation of this kind can happen in other states as well. So can you explain to us, how your organization, Illinois Families for Public Schools, decided to promote a bill? Oh, I see there's a cat behind. Decided to promote a bill for children's right to play, and what went into the decision to do it, and what you went through to do it, and also what actually does the bill say?
So this has been really a long fight. We took it up legislatively just in the last couple of years, but parents in Illinois have been pushing for a recess law for a really long time, like at least 15 years. This bill was like the 11th bill introduced into the Illinois General Assembly on recess. And so it's been, this really long-term battle. Some of the earlier bills even were only asking for like 10 minutes required and still couldn't get passed. There was a task force finally about 10 years ago in 2011, and its recommendations, it had, teachers, administrators, people from all over the state, and the recommendation was that there should be at least 30 minutes K through 8, but then that was sort of set aside, that final report, and nothing really happened with it. Chicago Public Schools finally got some required recess back in 2012, and so there are a few bigger districts in Illinois. East St. Louis is another one that had recess on the books, but really nowhere else. Not many places had policies. And so there's also been a push here though. Right now, under the accountability plan for the federal government, there's no test data from first and second grade. And that is something that's been discussed. There's now a required observational assessment for kindergarten. And so there's been an idea that we really need to start doing something for those other early grades. And we kind of wanted to get out in front of that. And we're like, let's, we don't want more testing in early grades, and we need to say what we do want, and we need to protect that time for play. And that was really sort of the motivation to actually get legislation finally on the books to say that we need to have this protected playtime. And so one of the sort of novel things that I think also helped get the bill passed is that it says that you have to have 30 minutes of playtime, unstructured time, screen-free, and that time counts towards the clock hours, like the instructional day. And so schools don't have to lengthen the day. They do have to, rearrange the time, but it won't, it puts play on an equal footing with, say, academic things, because this really counts as learning time. It counts as instructional hours. And so I think that was a big component in getting it passed. It is probably one of the longer required periods in recess laws that are on the books now. But it also has some components that I think some other laws don't, that I think we're really happy got in there. And so one is this idea that you can't withhold the playtime as punishment. That is something that we even heard, from districts where they had play policies or recess policies that parents really wanted. And so that's sort of a key thing. Playtime and physical education class are two separate things. And so one doesn't count for the other. Also that the time can't be spent on screens. I think that's a really important component now, especially after the pandemic. And then also that children with disabilities need to have access to play. And so if there are, if you need accommodations or services, that has to be provided. And so all of those components are trying to make it as accessible as possible and really as integrated into the educational experience as possible. So that's what's in there.
That sounds very comprehensive and has a lot of.
Yeah, it sounds comprehensive. And who wrote it? Who wrote the bill?
Mostly me, with help. Yeah. So it's certainly simpler than a privacy law.
Yeah.
Some policies and laws around the country on the books. So looking at that language is helpful. And talking to, we really put together a big coalition of organizations. So from environmentalists to defending the early years and early childhood groups, and also disability rights activists. And so they were very helpful, especially looking at drafting and amending the language.
And can you tell a little bit about the process? Like, what would you say? We have some working groups who are, people who are getting together, thinking about advocating for play. What would you like to share with people, some takeaways about the advocacy process, getting that bill passed? I know it was a lot of back and forth, and there were times when you didn't think it was going to happen, but it'd be great to kind of just hear some advice for others who might want to do something similar.
Yeah. I mean, I think, to get legislation done, you have to have the votes. And so you have to, figure out who is going to support and how to get to them. And at the state level, it doesn't take that many constituents calling a state legislator to get them to respond. Certainly here in Illinois, people don't necessarily know who their state legislators are, and they don't know how actually really important they are in terms of, how daily life exists and how government runs. A lot of stuff is done at the state level, especially for education. Like really, even with lots of local control, it's the state that is sort of a key factor in that. And so, finding constituents in there's districts and building up those local networks is really what can eventually get you the votes to get something passed. Another part of the process was that we wrote as expansive as a of a bill as we could from the start, because we know that, you know, through the negotiation process, things are negotiated down. So the original bill actually asked for 60 minutes K through 8, which I, you know as Posse and Bill were just talking about, like that is the research supports that much time and the value of that. But really the pushback to say that you could spend 60 minutes on play a day was, you know, huge. And also the pushback, the idea that 6th through 8th graders, that middle schoolers need this time too, was also really, really, you know, that was pretty much unsurmountable. And so I think getting this initial half hour for K through 5 on the books is really helpful, and that lays the groundwork to push for more. But, you know, you definitely have to ask for a lot, knowing that you're going to have to negotiate it and you're going to cut some stuff away. So that's really key as well, I think.
Was there any pushback about the section about not using recess in a coercive way? Because I've noticed for decades, actually, that it's very automatic for teachers, even progressive teachers. I've seen make kids stay in from recess if they didn't bring their homework, or if they didn't finish some academic task or something. And then there are more extreme ways that that coercion takes place. But teachers use recess to get kids to comply with their demands of whatever, because recess is what kids love and need. That's why it becomes the carrot. And I'm just wondering, was that tough to get through, or was there pushback on that?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely heard even from some legislators, like not even so much as like, you know, using this as like the carrot kind of thing, but as like, you know, if some student does something wrong, then we need to punish them, and you've got to have something that's, you know, feels like a punishment.
Right.
And so to explain that, like, look, if you're really concerned about how kids are interacting with each other, about, you know, behavior in the classroom, you need this time to play and to self-regulate, and it's absolutely counterproductive to be withholding this autonomous time when you're facing those kind of issues. And so, yeah, it's a perpetual problem. You know, a good policy has been on the books in Chicago Public Schools saying that you can't withhold recess as punishment since 2012, and it still happens. And, you know, we constantly have to point parents to the right board policy and say, here it is, show it to you. This is not okay, you can't. So, you know, even after that many years, it's still a problem.
Yeah. And I think it just, you know, it stems from our confusion about discipline, consequences, and punishment, right? Like, you know, and which one changes behavior, and it's really consequences, right? And discipline, not punishment. So, and I remember thinking that same thing when I was a preschool director, and my teachers were like, no, we don't do that here. We don't withhold recess as punishment. And I was like, really? That's what we did in the public schools of DC. And they're like, yeah, we don't do that here. And it forced me to think outside the box. How do you then change your way so that you're not withholding something that is so important and so valuable to children and doesn't really serve a purpose other than to make their life miserable to take that away, you know? And so that's really important. So what comes next? I know this, and I'm glad you said how specific the bill was, because I see this a lot. I went to law school and studied a little bit about policy, and I see people trying to push a bill that is so broad that I know there's going to no way, because the last thing they want to do is have it back in the courts trying to be interpreted by the judges who didn't write it, right? So it's really great that you made this very specific. But the next part is implementation, right? I don't know how things work in Illinois, but I'm assuming there might be some guidance. How are we going to get the teachers, the schools to, one, be aware of this new policy, to, I don't want to say enforce it, but to implement it, to make sure it's being implemented and that students are having this. Do you guys have a plan, a strategic plan in mind for that, or what are your thoughts around that?
So it hasn't been signed yet by the governor, so that it was just sent to the governor actually yesterday, and hopefully it will get signed quickly. It can take up to 60 days, but it's effective immediately. So this fall schools should be, or, you know, when schools start mid-August, that's actually really soon. And so schools should be implementing it immediately. And I think it will be a big shift for some places. Like some places may have recess, but it's really informal, or they're kind of balancing. Physical education is required here in Illinois. And so some places may have been kind of counting recess as PE or vice versa. And so it'll be a big shift. And just in terms of the minutes a day that are being devoted to, say, especially math and reading, it's huge. And there's just such an attachment to that and a fear about not spending the maximum amount of minutes doing academic instruction that I think schools and administrators are also worried about because of pressure tied to testing. So the State Board of Ed has reached out to us to get our ideas about, you know, what we were envisioning for this. I think the specific language definitely helps. And so you don't have to depend on things being written into regulations and policies. There's not an enforcement mechanism that's in the law. So, you know, it really is a matter of making sure, especially that parents know about the law and they know what to expect and what they can demand. Really it's an organizing issue to make sure that, you know, parents can come together and say, hey, this isn't happening at our school. Why? It's on the books now as a law. We need this. And I think it's, especially with play, it's constantly this education and framing of this actually is valuable, and it's a valuable experience in education as anything else. And really making sure that, you know, that you think of it that way and sharing that. You know, there's a big push here in Illinois from the State Board of Education to increase the amount of state testing, to not just have it annual, but to have it 3 times a year, and to expand it down to K through 2. And so that would technically be optional, but once the state pays for it and it's attached to the high stakes stuff that starts in 3rd grade, it's not so optional. So, you know, really talking to the same people who are like, yeah, I'm really excited about play, and telling them about, you know, why play has disappeared and, you know, what's taken its place, and what we need to push for in that way ties in with making sure that, you know, this play really happens, and that it actually, you know, we're actually following the spirit and the letter of this law.
Yeah, and I wanted to clarify, you said earlier that you said it's not the same as PE. Did you say if it can be recess, could it be that the kids just get to go outside for 30 minutes, or was it specifically playing inside a classroom or indoors sort of?
So it's agnostic on that. So that was a big like barrier to some of the earlier recess bills that were introduced in Illinois. Schools, for whatever reason, are like, we can't, you know, we don't have the physical facilities. And so it encourages schools to hold the playtime outside. And if it's inside, they are encouraged to make sure that physical activity is possible. So you can, you know, as a kindergarten classroom, you could say, okay, here's, you know, of this 30 minutes, 15 minutes is going to be in the classroom and it's free play time. And, you know, so it really does actually give the schools a fair amount of flexibility in terms of, it has to be at least 15-minute periods of play. So you can't just like have like a 5-minute break in between things and be like, that's our playtime, kids. But it also gives, you know, schools the option of, if it has to be inside, then, you know, they can do it that way and fulfill it that way. And so, yeah, but it can't count for physical education and vice versa. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I hope some of the schools, if they're, I would love to get some, I'm sure I can get some folks, there's research we could do around this to show that it works. I think it was a school district in Texas that extended recess, like doubled the time for recess, and all of a sudden, like behavior problems went away, reading scores went up. Like, let's really show that you don't need this extra testing in K through 2, right? You really need to take advantage of this as an opportunity to kind of see how kids do with this more time to just play and engage, and how the teachers can really document their learning and everything that's happening and show that it is beneficial, right? Even if it's just a break from all of the prepping for the testing that's going on anyway, right? It's still a very nice something for the kids to have. And I think it's important that we show that importance to it as well. So, we did have one question. We weren't really able to have a lot of time for questions, but someone did ask, how can we build on this work to expand the right to play? What else do you think others can do, or what are you guys thinking about doing? What comes next for you guys in your organization in Illinois?
I think really the key to the reason play has been removed really is the high stakes testing and accountability systems. And so pushing back on the amount of testing and pushing back on how testing is used and what it's used for really is, that's been the driver of many things out of the education system. And so, to put play back in, we really need to, change how we think about testing, and we need to organize in order to get the federal law changed. And those are the things that will, those are the reasons that we were being given by legislators that we shouldn't have this bill and that it's not possible to put this time into the day. And so that, I think, is, really at the root of why we don't have this. And, I think the optimistic thing is that even, NCLB and ESSA, ESSA is on the books, and the Every Student Succeeds Act, but we still managed to get this passed here in Illinois. And so, I think one of the things that we tried to communicate was that if it's imposed at the state level, then everyone has to follow through on it. And so it's this sort of universal disarmament in this arms race to do ever more prepping for tests. It's like, okay, well, this is just some time that no one will get to do test prep, and everyone will have to spend on play. And so that is sort of a way to say, we have to carve out this time and protect it, no matter what the feds are requiring us to prepare for 3rd through 8th grade. So I think that's another sort of message that people can use. And, we are a tiny group with a tiny budget, and, you can still get a lot done through organizing. And, the foundations that we laid down, that were laid down before us working on this bill, that organization that did that, Communities Organizing and Organization and Family Issues, they were also part of our coalition now, even though they've been, it's been a while since that was one of their issues. And the organizing I did on testing when my daughter was in 1st grade, she's now a freshman. We did a play-in that was actually described in Posse and Bill Doyle's book. And, the people who came out to the play-in, I was still, reaching out to them, and the connections that we made then, those are still people who were supporting this law many years later. So that the organizing component is really important. And, building up a network of people who value this, and that you can then call on to say, hey, remember how much you think play matters? Pick up your phone and call your state representative.
Yeah, that's amazing. And we're going to have a representative to help us talk to a little bit about that as well, too, and how important that is. Yeah, and so it sounds like that coalition building. And someone asked about advice to people doing this in similar states, and it sounds like really reaching out to those networks and getting people on to support you. But I really like that idea of looking at the pressures of what's keeping this out, which is testing, and then how do we dismantle that, right? Because that would be great if we also got no testing in K through 5, and then along with your right to play, and we should, right? We don't need as much testing as people think we do, but we're just kind of in this, we're stuck in this accountability rat race where we can't seem to get out from underneath it and just say, like, we don't need to be testing kids as much as we are. But that's the biggest obstacle to having more time for play and having people okay with that time for play. We don't, I worry about teachers whenever a law is imposed on teachers. You're concerned about how they're going to respond, right? And so I hope there's ways that we can support the educators in Illinois to see the value in this. Like, it's okay to step back and to allow this to be a part of your day. It's super important. Nancy, did you have any other questions before we?
Just the comment that this whole issue of recess, the loss of recess and the loss of recess time, it's all arisen as a result of the education reform movement, the accountability and data-driven education and evaluating kids and teachers and money tied to scores and school survival tied to scores. And we started seeing recess disappearing in relation to the pressures of ed reform and the kind of panic that people got thrown into about their school survival or their own personal survival or kids' achievement or whatever. And those stakes, high stakes tests, are what caused this whole recess problem. So it's a bigger picture. I think it's terrific to work on increasing play, restoring play, and at the same time to remember this is happening because of the education reform movement that's been going on for 20 years that's, transformed education in the United States in a really negative way.
Yeah, I mean, we were really hoping to have, we didn't know whether we could get this passed, but we thought it was a really valuable place to start conversations with legislators and say, if you oppose this bill, why do you oppose it? And, what do you actually value in our schools? And, so we heard a lot, even from people who ended up voting no, I love recess. I think this is a great bill, but I can't support it. And so to really pin people down and have those conversations, it might take more than one legislative cycle to get something passed, but you have to start with that. And I think it's really important to sort of push towards that, why do we value these tests over our actual human children's experience in the classroom and on the playground? And so getting parents involved in those conversations, then, eventually you can get something done.
That seems extremely valuable, actually, that the introducing legislation like this opens the door to a lot of dialogue in the community, with legislators, with parents, with teachers, gets people talking about these bigger education issues. So it seems like it has, more than just the immediate goal of getting the legislation passed. I think it has a lot of spillover positive effects too.
Absolutely, yeah, and it has the power, I think, to really engage people. Like we were talking with Posse and Bill, we need a framework, a philosophy about the rights of children and what they're entitled to kind of drive us, right? So that we're not just being reactive to new things that are popping up, but we're being proactive and we're living in those values and we're living in those beliefs and we're centering all our work on that. And then it's easy to tear down things that don't go along when you have a philosophy. But it sounds like our philosophy is, test them till they drop, and for what? It's just, in the name of what are we doing this to our children, right? They don't need all these tests, even to go to Harvard and Princeton and the Ivies, right? They still don't need to be bombarded with so many tests. That's not really helpful. So how do we really support that, I think is important. And really changing the narrative and expanding the conversation as well, too. Well, Kathy, thank you so much for joining us. We are super excited to be able to support your work. Nancy wrote the fabulous statement that DEY shared. I know that was shared in the beginning, but that it was really important that you had local people on. So you didn't need us for the testimony part, but we were just so grateful to just be able to watch it in action. The text message alerts and the email alerts about what was happening was very, very instrumental for me and someone who wants to get into the policy, and it was just very great. And so we please keep in touch. We want to keep hearing about the process and what goes on. Fingers crossed it's signed, or it's just not signed and it just becomes law very soon. We will support that. And then yeah, if there's anything we can do to help support teachers, parents in Illinois who want to know more about this, we'd be happy to do some type of joint collaboration to really make sure that it happens for everyone.
Thank you guys so much. Thanks for sharing information about it, and I'm happy to field questions from people about how to get this done elsewhere.
Fantastic. Thanks for being with us, Cassie.
Thanks.
All right, and now I have the honor and privilege of introducing Congressman Jamal Bowman, who represents New York 16th Congressional District. He serves as the Vice Chair of the House Committee on Education and Labor in the 117th Congress, including a subcommittee on early childhood, elementary, and secondary education. Jamal was a middle school principal and has been a teacher and public school advocate for 20 years. I was delighted the first time we met. I think you hosted us at Casa Middle School for a big public education event with NPE and some other folks. And then watching you ascend to Congress and do this has just been super exciting. And so thank you so much for making time for us to join us today, Jamal. Nancy and I are just thrilled to have you here.
Well, good to see you. Hello, Nancy. How's it going? Great to be with you. And Denisha, you are such a rock star, a powerhouse. You are so relentless. I think the last time we saw each other, we were at a Journey for Justice event in Washington, D.C. together, I believe. And you know, I think there you were telling me you were working on a doctorate and in law school at the same time, or something insane like that. And I was just like, I don't even want to hear it. I was overwhelmed hearing the story. But it's great to see you working at Sarah Lawrence College. It's full circle for you and me, because I represent Yonkers as part of New York 16, and Sarah Lawrence is in our district. And we're actually going to be doing a retreat there in a couple of weeks. So thank you for all you do. Thank you for doing this event tonight. And so what are we talking about? Bring me up to speed. What's the excitement around? What's happening?
I just want to say my appreciation of you and your work, Jamal, because I get emails from you every day or from your office. But,
sorry about that. Sorry. We just want to keep people looped in.
I admire what you're doing, and thank you for furthering the cause of justice and democracy for all people. Appreciate it so much.
Of course.
So we wanted to talk to you as early childhood educators and advocates, and to get your advice and wisdom about how we try to influence policy. You, as an educator, you know well what's happened with the education reform movement that pushed down fiercely, really, into early childhood, and started to change the early childhood atmosphere, even in preschool, right through second grade, third grade, of kids getting drilled and more worksheets and a disappearance of play and the arts, creative thinking, original thinking, child choice, and all the things we early childhood educators not only value, but increasingly over the last 15 or 20 years, there's been so much science research that shows the effects on brain development and the effects on health and well-being of active play, interactive play, socialization, play-based learning, all of these things that in our field we've always, that our field rests on, really. There's a sort of a knowledge base that's at the root of early childhood education that's pretty much shared in the early childhood community. But here we are at a place where it's what we know in our field is entirely unmoored from what the heck is happening in schools and the policies that are driving what's happening in schools, which are much more an outgrowth of the model that ed reform has pushed. more testing and teacher-driven instruction and so forth, academic skills, even on 4-year-olds. So what we're wanting to understand is, how do we as a profession get a voice into policymakers' ears that helps us explain to them what is quality, appropriate, healthy early childhood education, especially now when funds are coming into early childhood and we're getting increasingly worried that they're going to go in the wrong direction of more of what's already so harmful.
Yeah, so great question. And to give you one example to further illustrate your point, one of my colleagues here, the amazing Nakima Williams, one of the lead organizers in Georgia, who helped us to win Georgia for the president and both the 2 Senate seats. When we decided to allow testing to take place in school districts across the country and actually pushed for it, not we, but the U.S. Department of Education. As you all know, we pushed back against that, and we wrote a letter trying to stop that from happening to the White House and pushed very, very forcefully against that. In her state of Georgia, her daughter was forced to go back to school just to take a test. And her daughter is 5 years old in kindergarten. So she's not even at the testing age yet, which is usually 3 through 8. She was forced to come back to kindergarten and take tests, where they're literally learning in kindergarten to bubble in answer sheets, as we all know. And so this is happening all over the country. It's a huge, huge problem. The good news is, I always credit the movement for helping someone like me get to Congress. As Denisha mentioned, we were in this fight for many, many years prior to me even thinking about running for office. So that is a big deal, and it's a big win for all of us. In addition to that, the Speaker of the House, Speaker Pelosi, the Assistant Speaker of the House, Catherine Clark, the Chair of the Appropriations Committee, Rosa DeLauro, and many other teachers who are in Congress, like Rep. Takano and Rep. Johanna Hayes and others, are right there with you in terms of what needs to happen in our schools, with our kids, and with our young children. So the more they hear, particularly leadership, and the White House is on the same page. First Lady Jill Biden on the same page with us, and President Biden's on the same page. The more they hear from outside groups who are organized like NPE, the more likely they are to move on legislation. I also want to encourage you all to be in consistent communication with Chairman Bobby Scott of the House Ed and Labor Committee and Chairperson Patty Murray on the Senate side, so they can understand everything you just shared, the research, what's been harmful, what needs to happen. It's important to be in communication with those 2 people, because in many ways they are the gatekeepers, and they need to hear from educators as much as possible, both inside and outside. And then the other part of it is, this is not about teachers' unions. I support teachers' unions, and we always want to uplift them. But the distortion and the misleading information that's going on over the last 20 plus years is teachers' unions are the problem. That's why our kids aren't learning. We got to attack teachers' unions. And as we know, attack on teachers' unions in public schools have led to charter schools. It's not about teachers' union. You are all coming as scholars, as parents, as advocates for early childhood education. And you're just presenting evidence in support of going big on early childhood and many other aspects of education. So that's the federal piece. Locally, there has to be the same energy in organizing around early childhood education and what we know needs to happen in our schools. So Betty Rosa, new commissioner, right there with us. Misha Ross Porter, I know she's critiqued in a lot of ways, but I believe she's with us as well, especially the more she hears from all of you. But also, school districts run themselves more so than the federal government. So the Yonkers School District, the Mount Vernon School District, the New Rochelle School District, and other school districts, now that we have this money coming in, a lot of money coming in with the American Rescue Plan, a lot of money. So the issue is not money. The issue is mindset and coordinating resources. So it has to be a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. And the more you can all work with NPE, Journey for Justice, and other organizations together strategically, the better. So a strategic social media communication strategy or advocacy strategy, a consistent email advocacy strategy, consistent phone call advocacy strategy around these issues in a coordinated way will move. And then finally, I will add, you know, my office and offices like mine want to work with you on policy recommendations so that we can be like, we're about to introduce some public school policy in a couple of weeks, and we're going to be in touch with you all about that. But, you know, engaging with elected officials around policy recommendations is also very critical. Knowing what's out there, pushing in support of what's out there, but also pushing to bring new policy to the floor in terms of introduction of a bill, and then pushing to bring it to the floor for a vote. Those are some ways, and this is just to be clear, this is a day-to-day contact sport, like it really is. And I left out one group, the senators from New York, and whoever's on the call from other states, your senators from that state, they are key players in this. And all of us here in Congress, we respond to people who call us the most. So if they're getting more calls from the charter lobby, they're going to respond to that. If they're not getting enough calls from us, they're not going to respond to us. So that's another key point. We have to be consistently engaged on a day-to-day basis around these issues, because that the special interests, they're relentless, because for them this is about money and power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I laughed because I didn't call you that many times before you said yes, but that's good to know. That's very good to know.
Persistence helps. It matters.
It does help. And it's great. And, you know, the question I had was thinking about how do we build. I think part of what's challenging for us in early childhood is that we're not connected to other issues, right? So I see my work in early childhood as also promoting racial justice, right? Also thinking about trauma and racial trauma and how do we address that, and thinking about that. But there's also I think we need to think about broader coalitions, right? Like the fight for $15 an hour is a childcare issue because that affects childcare workers who are part of the early childhood community, right? Fights for healthcare, fights on the environment. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how we might broaden our coalition and work with more on the ground kind of grassroots groups like the Working Families Party, right? Right. How, you know, I think that's another avenue where we're missing out on, because we can't only target people who have young children. This has got to go beyond that. I don't have any children, and I don't teach young children, although I teach their teachers, right? But we have to kind of create a groundswell of support that this is important for everybody, regardless of if you have children or how old they are.
You're 100% correct. Broad coalitions are key here. And if you want to put it under the umbrella of community health or public health or racial justice or trauma, this all falls under that umbrella, right? So we can have housing justice, we can have healthcare justice, education justice, early childhood, defending the early years, trauma. And the trauma piece is big because it overlaps into the medical profession. You know, the research on ACEs, for example, that's medical research. That's not even education research. Education is just catching up to that. But as we talk about defending the early years, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about ensuring that our kids have a nurturing, healthy upbringing beginning at the prenatal stage. But this is a way to cross paths with healthcare and education and healthcare working in tandem and working together. So my office would love to be in touch with you to connect you with these other organizations, because they're out there fighting, like it is happening right now. And you know, you may already know this, and you know, before I wasn't talking about teachers unions, but now I'll bring them in. AFT and NEA are two very powerful, very respected unions in our country, probably two of the most powerful and most respected. So working with them will be key. But then there are many other, you mentioned Working Families Party. I would add Community Voices Heard. I would add Make the Road. I would add New York's Communities for Change. I would add the Sunrise Movement. I would add, the indivisible groups. I would add Democratic Socialism. All these groups are working for justice. They're working for a better world. So yes, working in tandem and in collaboration with them is key. I also want to reiterate, the people in the House right now who really, really support this issue are in leadership in the House. So I didn't mention Steny Hoyer before, but he's the majority leader out of Maryland. Speaker Pelosi, Assistant Speaker Clark, the White House, all super locked in on the issue of our children overall, but particularly childcare and early childhood education.
Thank you. Yeah. Nancy, did you have another question?
Oh, I was just going to reflect that one of the obstacles we have in the early childhood field is that because the field is fragmented in the sense that there are a lot of individual centers and programs. When you talk about teachers unions, one of the advantages of them is that it's a way that teachers are organized to talk to each other about issues they share and find a common voice to sort of support children and the education that they know is right for children. And it's a vehicle for empowerment. And in the early childhood field, we don't have that because the field is so fragmented with all different kinds of care, private, public, family daycare, home care, all kinds of things. So many caregivers don't even have relationships with other caregivers. So we started Defending the Early Years as an effort to try to bring the field together with some kind of a common voice. And it's like Denisha said, it's a little hard because there are all these silo organizations. They're wonderful, all the justice organizations working on all these different issues, but early childhood has been a bit kind of out there in a separate silo. And we're trying really hard to get the interest and the understanding about how vital these years are into the consciousness of other people. It's work. It's a hard work.
It's a lot of work. But it's happening, right? I think, not just with this call. I mean, care, the care economy, childcare is, COVID revealed to the world how essential childcare is and how our economy cannot work without childcare. So it's a part of the Americans Families Plan that is going to be coming really, really soon from the White House and from Congress. It's a part of that. It's a big part of that. And, an overlooked part of it is giving early child care providers, if they have the credentials, the opportunity to earn the same wage as teachers who work for K-12, which is huge, as you all know, and the opportunity to collectively bargain, to organize, form a union, and collectively bargain. So those two things are a part of the American Families Plan that's coming from the White House. Now, Republicans will try to take it out. We are not going to let them, and it's going to pass through reconciliation. But that's something, and defending the early years, if you have like policy leads or experts, it's really important for those people to be in touch with offices like mine and to just stay abreast on what's coming from the White House, because then you can say, oh, this is right, this is wrong, this needs to be taken out, we need to push here on this. So if I don't know if y'all got budgets or whatever, but the policy piece to this is really, 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 really critical. And, I have a ledge team, for my office, and I'm going to talk to them after this to see who the policy people in the early years, who are they? Because if you're not connected to them, it's important to be connected to them, because again, the White House is trying to do a lot of very good things with the support of the House. It's just Republicans are trying to push back.
Yeah, and I think that's really key. You know, we're a small but mighty organization, but we do have some great partners who are working through our working groups who are thinking about policy and play and early childhood in that realm as well, too. You know, the one thing that's really concerning, this American Families Act, and, you know, we heard President Biden, you know, kind of push back on the idea of care, right? And there's a lot of us who recognize that in the early years, it should be a care model, right? There's nothing wrong with this idea of childcare, but so there's this concern, you know, where I used to be like, you know, all about universal pre-K, but now I'm terrified that it's going to turn into, you know, 4-year-olds sitting there completing worksheets all day in the name of getting ready for kindergarten. So I think there's, you know, for us, it's like, how do we, within the, you know, within a Democratic led administration, kind of shine that voice? Where I'd just be happy, actually, Jamal, if we just got the option, right? If you just said, we're going to give you this and we're going to fund early childhood, and if you want it to be academic, go for it. If you want it to be play-based, go for it. But we don't even get the option. We don't even give we talk about school choice all the time, but we don't give parents the choice to say, I want play. I want to be able to send my child to a, you know, a government funded program that's play all day. I shouldn't have to pay for that out of pocket, which is what happens now, right? So it's not available to our low-income children, low-income families. So how do we, like, I guess it's trying to wedge in, because there are tons of policy people in early childhood who are going to say, okay, with more pre-K 4 or pre-K in general, but it's going to be challenging for a lot of people if it's not done, you know, in a way that honors what we know about children and their development.
Yeah, and that's where you got to move things locally. Because a lot of those decisions are made locally. Like, what does the early childhood learning environment look like? And you know, and I don't think it's like, see, when you and I talk, and we all here talk, we understand each other. But when you talk to people who don't understand, they just think you mean kids playing all day, and like, and just run. They just see kids running around all day, playing. And personally, there's a lot of benefit to that, just in terms of social skills and emotional intelligence and executive function development and all of that. So I'm with you there. But when we talk to these people locally, like, we got to make the learning connection and just help them understand that learning overall just looks differently. Like, it looks different than sitting down doing worksheets. Like, here's what it should look like and here's why. And if you can move things locally with parent groups and others, then the shift will begin to happen. Nationally, unfortunately, there are still many corporate actors in play, both in the White House, both with Ed Trust, and even the U.S. Department of Education, that is still influencing things to their favor. But again, the more energy that comes from the outside and within from people like myself and others, the more we're going to see the shift. Again, shift is happening already. It's already happening to a certain extent. But to take that further step, locally organized, while also putting pressure on the levers of power in Washington.
Yeah, that's really helpful. One of the sort of social justice, racial justice aspects of this, Denisha sort of mentioned it, so I'll just say it a little more explicitly, is that we've already seen that the impact of the ed reform pressures and changes in early childhood have weighed most heavily on children in low-income communities, children of color in low-income communities. So one of the things we're worried about is, as the new money comes in, that there's this siphoning off of, you know, increased pressure with that money on low-income kids of color. And because there's this argument that, oh, middle-class kids, they can play fine. It's fine. It's these underprivileged kids who we have to drill. And we really have to change that mindset, because those are the kids that most need a play-based, activity-centered early childhood experience.
Yeah, I mean, I got to run because I got to go vote. But to that point, Black kids need the same as every other kid. Like, that's kids right. Are kids. You know what I'm saying? Like, kids are kids. All kids need the same thing, right? Yep. Different because we're all different, but the same. Like, yeah. To claim, and it's so racist to claim this, right? To claim that, okay, these Black children are behind because of whatever the circumstances are, so they need direct, explicit instruction and rigorous work so that they can catch up, versus these kids who come from privilege, oh, they get to play. It's crap, and it's racist,
Yeah.
and it's not research-based at all, and it's
true.
really stupid. Like
All
it's just bad on so many levels. So you're right. All kids need play. All kids need nurturing environments. And all kids need enrichment opportunities because it helps us all grow as accordingly to the way we should develop it as children. I hate to rush out, but I gotta vote. If I don't vote, I'm gonna get in trouble.
Please go vote and keep being a voice. Jamal, thank you so much for reaching out.
Appreciate you and your time. Thank you.
Of course, peace and love. I'll talk to y'all soon. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Well, I think we've got it. We keep hearing it. I think it's good. Sometimes people say, "Oh, you're preaching to the choir." I call it feeding the choir soul a little bit. We need to hear from our supporters from time to time. We need to know we're not in this alone. That there are people who agree with us. There's a bunch of people who learn something new every time. So, well, folks, thank you so much for joining us for day 2. We're in a treat for one more day. Tomorrow is day 3, and our focus is really thinking about early childhood and equity and early childhood and liberation and early childhood and healing. So we've put together an amazing panel. We're going to begin with a keynote by Takima Bunch-Smith, who is a good friend of ours, who was part of our institute last year and who's just doing amazing work on behalf of children and thinking about racial justice and education and early childhood education. And then we have a panel discussion to follow her keynote with just some amazing advocates in the field. Lelena Garcia, who's a kindergarten teacher in New York City, Ashley Brailsford, who's doing this amazing Our Joyful Learning program, which is looking at nature and Indigenous and Black and children of color. We're going to have Megan Madison, who just recently published an amazing children's book called Our Skin, that's really looking at how do we have conversations about race and racism with young children. And it's just going to be an amazing time. So we hope that you will tune in tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern for day 3, the final day of our institute. Thank you all so much. Thank you again to William Doyle, to Pazzi Solberg, to Cassie Cresswell, to Congressman Jamal Bowman, to Nancy Carlson Page, to our behind the scenes folks, Blakely Bundy, my wonderful co-director, and again to Jiro Studios. Thank you guys so much. We will see you tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern.